Good evening and welcome. Thank you for braving this inclement weather. Coming down, I didn't anticipate this good a turnout. I'm pleased. For the next 10 weeks, we're going to be talking about the apocalypse archetype. Fairly close study of the book of Revelation. And I've divided it up into assignments. Let me list those assignments. No assignment for tonight. This is just introduction. But next week, session 2, we'll cover chapters 1, 2, and 3. Third sessions, chapters 4 and 5. Fourth session, chapters 6 and 7. Fifth session, chapters 8, 9, and 10. Sixth session, 11, 12, and 13. Seventh session, 14, 15, 16. Number 8 will be 17 and 18. Number 9 will be chapters 19 and 20. And session 10 will be chapters 21 and 22. As most of you know, if you've been here before, I rather like the Jerusalem Bible. It makes less difference with the Greek scriptures than it does with the Hebrew, but nonetheless, I still suggest it, especially because it's the only readily available version that gives in footnotes all the Old Testament references. And you will notice that the book of Revelation is just loaded with direct quotations from the Old Testament. A handy version of it, they've issued a new revised version of the Jerusalem Bible called the New Jerusalem Bible. And this is a kind of handy version of it, providing your eyes are good. I rather like it just for its compactness. My procedure will be pretty much as usual. I'll talk for perhaps an hour, and then we'll have the remainder of the time for questions and discussion. I prefer written questions. I think one gets a more thoughtful level of interchange when the questioner writes it out, and then I have the chance to reflect on it. On the other hand, I will not rule out spontaneous questions from the floor, so you may use both mediums. I have no particular reading list this year. We'll be examining this text intensively rather than reviewing an extensive body of material. And what I would suggest is a careful reading of the assigned text each time, looking up each of the references that appear in the footnote. You will discover by doing that, it will be a kind of spontaneous amplification process, and you will discover what a rich mosaic this book is. You don't get this book by a superficial reading. In many ways it strikes the modern mind as bizarre and almost unintelligible. But if you apply yourself carefully to it, especially considering all of the quotations that are embedded in it, it starts to open up to you. I would point out to you a rather interesting book that's just been published recently. It's an interesting collection of apocalyptic dreams, something called Dreaming the End of the World. It's particularly interesting to me for the dreams, and I'll be quoting some of them in the course of our sessions. The author is not an analyst, and his approach is not even primarily a psychological one, but and his generalizations tend to they have a kind of quasi-Buddhist quality to them. His interpretation and generalizations, but he has a lot of good points to make, and it's very clear that he's gripped by this apocalypse archetype and has an earnest concern about the coming catastrophe. And as I say, the dreams that he's collected are quite worth examining. If someone would be so good as to bring me a glass of water, I would appreciate it. So let's start now with the subject matter proper. I always pay attention to other people's titles, and naturally also I pay attention, therefore, to my own titles. And my title is The Apocalypse Archetype. And I'm not going to assume anything on the part of my hearers. I'm going to identify both terms. So let's ask ourselves, first of all, what is an archetype? We probably think we know. Thank you very much. But it doesn't hurt to be reminded. First of all, an archetype is a pattern, a primordial psychic order of images that has a collective or generalized quality, and therefore can be seen as deriving from the collective transpersonal objective psyche rather than the personal psyche. That's one aspect of what it is, a pattern, typical primordial pattern. The other aspect, I think, that we don't pay quite as much attention to and really does deserve emphasis is that an archetype is a dynamic agency. It's a living organism, really, the psychic organism that inhabits the collective psyche. And the fact that an archetype is both a pattern and an agency means that an encounter with an archetype has two aspects. As a pattern, we can encounter it and speak about it as an object, something as an object of knowledge and understanding. But as a dynamic living agency, it appears as a subject. That means that it appears to us as an entity like ourselves, with intentionality and some semblance, at least, of consciousness. Jung refers to this double aspect of the archetype at the beginning of Answer Job. In paragraph 557, he talks about the archetypes, and here's what he says: they are spontaneous phenomena which are not subject to our will, and therefore they have a certain autonomy. They are to be regarded not only as objects, but also as subjects with laws of their own. If that's considered, we are compelled to treat them as subjects. In other words, we have to admit that they possess spontaneity and purposiveness, or a kind of consciousness and free will. Keep that in mind as we proceed talking about the apocalypse archetype, because Like all archetypes, when it's evoked and when it's constellated or activated, it then takes on a autonomy and tends to direct anything of a psychic nature in its vicinity to line up according to its lines of force. The other term in my title is apocalypse. Now, apocalypsis is just the Greek word that was used for the book of Revelation, and it means revelation. It's translated as revelation. But more specifically, if you dissect the word a bit, it refers to the uncovering of what has been hidden. The root is calypto, the verb calypto, which means to cover or to hide, and apo, preposition, means away or from. So apocalypse means to take the covering away from what had been secret or covered, and thus revealing something that previously had been invisible. But according to general usage, the term apocalypse has taken on the larger meaning of the coming of deity to assert sovereignty, or the coming of a Messiah to judge, reward, and punish humanity. We have a whole body, whole genre of what's called apocalyptic literature in antiquity. They grew up around the idea of apocalypse. There are a number of both Jewish and Christian apocalypses in the extra canonical literature. But certainly the apocalypse of John that we're going to study is the most famous of that genre. The main characteristics of this literature is that it's a description of dreams or visions or journeys to heaven, in which the seer is shown otherworldly secrets and programs of world history culminating in the end of the age. That's what's typical about the apocalyptic literature. And they almost all have images of a last judgment with the coming of a Messiah or a divine king who will impose his punishments and reconstitute things and bring about a new order. So there are four chief features to this literature and to the image of the apocalypse: revelation, judgment, destruction or punishment as a consequence of judgment, and then renewal in a new world. Now, what I call the apocalypse archetype is what underlies all this literature. And it's composed of a network of interrelated images, as all archetypes are, that go to make up a complex symbol system. I thought I'd try to hint at some of the images that cluster around this archetype in the chart that you all have a copy of. I could have put in a lot more. What I put in are almost arbitrary because, as you know, once one starts charting the network of an archetype, it can extend farther and farther. And if you keep going, you can encompass the whole collective unconscious. But then you drown in the process. So you have to impose some kind of limits. But perhaps it offers a kind of roadmap to the subject matter that we're going to be talking about. Most of these subjects will come up in more detail later. I'm not going to go into them into the chart now, but it's just as a general overview for purposes of orientation. So remember that what we're going to be talking about is a primordial psychic pattern of the collective unconscious that is at the same time a dynamic agency with intentionality, and that when it constellates, it generates itself. It's self-generative then, and manifests itself in the individual psyche and the group and the collective psyche that it touches, and lives itself out then through whatever psychic stuff it can appropriate. Archetypes are like devouring mouths, you know. They find little egos that they can consume, and then they live out of those egos. This archetype certainly constellated very powerfully at the beginning of the Christian Aeon, and that was why so much apocalyptic literature was generated. And now, again, at the beginning of or on the verge of the beginning of another new Aeon, it's again constellating very powerfully. And I'm going to be giving examples of different ways that happens as we go along in both the individual and in the collective. I don't like to keep anybody in suspense, so I'm going to answer the basic question right at the start, and then all the rest of the course will be an enlargement upon it. The basic question that I'm concerned with is, what does the apocalypse mean psychologically? And my formula answer to that question is, apocalypse means the coming of the self into conscious realization. And when this happens, it's a momentous event. Of course, it's experienced to manifest itself in very different ways if it takes place in an individual psyche or if it takes place in the collective. Very different indeed. But in either case, it's a momentous event, because it is literally world-shattering. That's what the content of the archetype speaks about: shattering the world as it's been and redoing it. Now, certainly in terms of collective phenomena, we have evidence all around us in our daily analytic practice and in contemporary world history that this earth-shaking archetypal event is taking place right here and now. It's already started. It's manifesting in international relations, in the breakdown of the social structures of Western civilization, in political, ethnic, and religious groupings, and in the psyches of individuals. One can perceive the apocalypse archetype active in all those various arenas once you have eyes to see it, once you're familiar with it. You see the further evidence in science fiction, books, movies, and television programs. You see it in the proliferation of apocalyptic cults, sects, and even mainstream fundamentalism is taking on apocalyptic tones. That has been a very prominent feature that I've noticed as I've been observing that the phenomenon for about more than the last half century. And 50 years ago, mainstream fundamentalists did not have the kind of apocalyptic presuppositions that they now have. It's been a big change. And linked to the apocalypse archetype and the idea of the coming of the divine sovereign, we have this image that's more and more gripping the modern mind, and that's the image of the possible encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence, which in many cases in science fiction, when it happens, is followed by apocalyptic consequences. It's an aspect of the same archetype. When we consider the phenomenon of religious groups who are quite explicitly identified with the archetype, and not just marginally so, I see a whole spectrum from one end to the other. At one extreme, one sees apocalyptic sects of a semi-suicidal nature that are often no more than large family groupings centered around a charismatic character who is quasi-criminal and or quasi-psychotic. Such figures as Charles Manson, Jim Jones, or David Koresh. Those are that's an extreme version of group possession, concrete group possession by the apocalyptic archetype. Moving along the spectrum, a little less extreme, but still pretty far out, are the bomb shelter stockpiling survivalist cults who are holing up in remote regions, heavily armed and waiting for Armageddon. Farther along the spectrum, on a larger scale, we have apocalyptic sects. The only difference between a cult, a sect, and a denomination is the numbers. If you only got a small group, you've got a cult. If they get up to 500,000 or 1 million members, you can't call them a cult anymore. They become a sect. And if you get 10 million members, then they're a bona fide denomination. Purely statistical. No other qualitative difference. Basically, of course, the larger the grouping, the more it gets ironed out, and the less the fire gets damped out of it. Let's say. Anyway, now coming to the apocalyptic sects. There are a number of those. Probably the most well-known are Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. Those are each approaching about a million, between 750,000 and 1 million members in the United States, and they've got worldwide connections too. So they're becoming almost conventional just by virtue of the statistics. And still farther along the spectrum are the relatively more moderate conventional fundamentalist churches and preachers who are convinced that the time of the end is upon us and are expecting to be raptured up to heaven any time. And there are millions and millions of Americans who have those convictions. Finally, at the complete other end of the spectrum of possession by the apocalypse archetype are the apparently secular, rationalistic environmentalists. I mean I don't mean just people that are concerned about the environment. I mean the ones who whose behavior and way of life indicate that they are functioning out of on the basis of a religious dimension to their libido. It's their passionate intensity that reveals the evidence of possession by the archetype. So you don't even have to be consciously religious to be possessed by the archetype. Those are some of the collective manifestations that are immediately visible. And then we have individual manifestations, which analysts, of course, are in a position to see all the time. And in this case, when the imagery of the apocalypse archetype comes up in the analytic process, it's immediately recognized as part of the phenomenology of the individuation process, representing the emerging of the self into conscious realization by the individual. And those four aspects that I mentioned earlier in the apocalyptic literature also apply in the individual manifestation: revelation, judgment, destruction or punishment, and new world. Revelation has the psychological correlate of a shattering new insight with the flow of transpersonal images into consciousness. That would be the individual version of revelation. Judgment is experienced in the form of a abrupt, profound awareness of the shadow, which at times can be so overpowering that it can threaten complete demoralization. When one suddenly is confronted with his dark and dubious nature that he's known all along abstractly and intellectually, but suddenly it comes into focus as living concrete reality. It's a big shock. And then the theme of destruction or punishment is manifested by anxiety in the individual. And the coming of a new world would correspond to the emergence of mandala and quaternity images as the possibility of a conscious relation to the self and its wholeness begins to appear. Now we're going to be talking about the apocalypse or revelation of St. John, the final book of the Jewish Christian Bible. And this book is really an amalgamation of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic imagery. It's really only semi-Christian. It's as though the imagery of the basic imagery of the apocalypse, which derives from other Jewish apocalyptic material, has had plastered onto it the image of Christ. It makes repeated references to the Old Testament prophecies of the great day of Yahweh, for instance. But what it does as the culmination of the Hebrew Christian canon. It lays out the final scenario of the end of the Christian Aeon and describes symbolically the concluding events of the Judeo-Christian myth, the myth that has been the womb and the metaphysical container of Western civilization. So it's no small thing that we're examining. An immense amount of scholarly work has gone into the study of this text by biblical scholars. And practically all of these scholars have been contained within the myth itself, so that they've been trying to understand their own mythological container. I find it very interesting as a depth psychologist to observe how individuals come to intellectual terms with mythological texts that they are still contained in. There's a lot of twisting and squirming. And it's a bit like fish trying to understand the properties of water, the medium that they are surrounded in. You see, it's not really possible to understand or to achieve the subject as an object until one's outside of it. You have to get outside of it before that becomes possible. And in general, the scholars have divided into four main camps, holding four main views about how to understand this text, the Revelation of John. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but most likely it's what we have here are evidence of temperamental variations, typological variations among scholars themselves. One group holds what's called a preterist interpretation. That's from the Latin word praeter, meaning beyond or past. And according to that view, the book of Revelation is a picture of current events in the Roman Empire that are taking place or had just recently taken place in the recent past, and that therefore they're not prophetic at all, but put into symbolic form that which is past. Praeter is just already taken place. The second viewpoint is called the historical, and it interprets Revelation as a symbolic representation of the entire course of church history leading up to the final consummation. The third group is called the futurist group. And according to this view, the text refers to events around the return of Christ coming sometime in the future. Finally, we have the idealistic or symbolic viewpoint, and that considers that the book of Revelation refers symbolically to the conflict of good and evil in any age, at any time, and is not specifically or literally historical. Kind of the Platonic view of Revelation, you might say. I would set up somewhat different set of categories looking at the text psychologically. First of all, we will see the text as a manifestation and a very powerful expression of the apocalypse archetype. The archetype, which can express itself in different contexts in the book of Revelation, which overlap and interpenetrate one another. Let me be more specific. I can detect different strands of different contextual reference running through the tapestry of the book. One of the strands is that it's a description of past concrete events in the sacred history of Israel. The outstanding example being the Babylonian exile. That was a experience of apocalypse for Israel, if ever there was one, a collective experience. And many of the Old Testament quotations that are embedded in Revelation refer to that incredible event, that it miraculously didn't destroy the whole nation. It's a miracle the nation survived that. That would be one. That's one strand of reference, archetypal reference. Second strand is reference to present concrete events. By present, I mean first century AD. Present. That would correspond to the preterist position, and there the chief reference would be to the Roman Empire and to the destruction of Israel, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Roman Empire, and then the anticipation that the Roman Empire itself was going to be destroyed by divine wrath. So that would be a second strand of manifestation. A third strand would be that it's a description of future concrete events, end of the age events. In other words, events occurring in our time. And we're in a position now, since we witness our contemporary events in our own lives, we can see how a good bit of this imagery fits. So, retrospectively, anyway, we can see that strand of future concrete events being present in the text. Still, another level would be what I would call to use a religious term, the eschatological strand, but to use a slightly more psychological term, you could also call it the pleromatic strand. I mean by this term that the book refers to events outside of time entirely that are taking place in the eternal or pleromatic realm of the psyche. In other words, they take place in the collective unconscious and don't even register at the level of ego consciousness. And an archetype, to the extent that it's pure archetype and does not descend or arise into incarnation, behaves in that fashion. It's an eternal drama that's going on all the time, you see. Then one more strand, and for us probably the most important strand of all, is understanding the book of Revelation as an expression symbolically of the psychic event of the coming of the self into conscious realization in the psyche of an individual. Now, I think undoubtedly the revelation of John is based on a personal visionary experience. But as I've indicated, it's obvious that the text as we have it has been influenced by other apocalyptic literature, frequently with direct quotes from that literature. The parallels with Ezekiel's vision are very striking. There are direct quotes from the book of Daniel. In addition, R.H. Charles, the scholar, has pointed out at least 20 parallels, if not actual quotes, from the book of Enoch, which was non-canonical. So it's evident that Revelation is a product of assimilation of one kind or another. Now, there are two, maybe more, but I think of two possibilities in understanding how this product may have come about, and there may be a mixture of the two. One possibility is that the original vision was stark and simple, and one or more editors structured and enlarged and amplified it out of their knowledge of the other literature. The other possibility is that, in the main anyway, the book of Revelation may have been written in somewhat the same fashion that the alchemical treatise Aurora Consurgens was written. That's a work. It's been published by Marie-Louise von Franz. That's a work that some even attribute to Thomas Aquinas. It's a work that integrates the biblical imagery, especially the Song of Songs, with the alchemical process. And it's evident, the way that it's done, that this is no cool, calm editor piecing things together. It was done out of the heat of a living experience, out of the mind of someone who, for whom the biblical imagery and the quotations were such living presences that they became the apt expression for the living experience he was having. This could quite possibly be the case with John. I have no way of knowing, but I do feel confident that one way or another, it is an assimilation product. In addition to assimilating the Jewish apocalyptic to the Christian worldview, it even incorporates a piece of classical Greek mythology, which we will get to. I won't go any farther. But I make a point of this assimilation issue because it's an important one for psychology. Jung has said, you find this in paragraph 521 of Mysterium, any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral. And I think we as Jungian psychologists know or ought to know from Jung that the analytic process, in order to achieve its full depth and effectiveness, must be related to the archetypal historical dimension of the personal experiences that the analysand is going through, and that's a the net result then is an assimilation product, you see. Now, the author of Revelation is not certain. I have the Anchor Bible Revelation, which unfortunately is now out of print. It's a very exhaustive commentary in the book of Revelation. And when it first came into my hands many years ago, I was astonished to read in the introduction that the editor had decided that John the Baptist was the author of the book of Revelation. That shows you how far some of the biblicists can go. That's not a very popular view, but anyway, traditionally, John the Evangelist and the author of at least John 1 and 2 is considered to be the author of Revelation. And for our purposes, you know, tradition is a psychic fact. Tradition posits the consensus omnium, so to speak. It's a statement of the collective psyche, and therefore has to be taken as a psychic fact at least on one level. Here's what Jung has to say on the subject of the authorship of page 6, or paragraph 698 of Answer Job. One could hardly imagine a more suitable personality for the John of the Apocalypse than the author of the epistles. It was he who declared that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. The Father has bestowed his great love upon us. He who is begotten by God commits no sin. John then preaches the message of love. God himself is love. Perfect love casteth out fear. He talks as if he knew not only a sinless state, but also perfect love, unlike Paul, who was not lacking in the necessary self-reflection. Under these circumstances, a counterposition is bound to grow up in the unconscious, which can then erupt into consciousness in the form of a revelation. It would then compensate the one-sidedness of individual consciousness. And he then goes on to point out how the violence of these visions would be commensurate with as compensation for John's conscious one-sidedness of emphasis on light and goodness. So that would mean then that John's personal psychology had some was one factor in the experience. But then he goes on to say, in paragraph 730, let us be psychologically correct, however. It's not the conscious mind of John that thinks up these fantasies. They come to him in a violent revelation. I'm skipping a bit. He was a passionately religious person with an otherwise well-ordered psyche, but he must have an intensive relation to God, which lays him open to an invasion far transcending anything personal. The really religious person in whom the capacity for an unusual extension of consciousness is inborn must be prepared for such dangers. The purpose of the apocalyptic visions is not to tell John, as an ordinary human being, how much shadow he hides beneath his luminous nature, but to open the seer's eye to the immensity of God, for he who loves God will know God. We can say that just because John loved God and did his best to love his fellows, also this gnosis, this knowledge of God, struck him. or to put it in psychological terms, we could say that his visions opened up his eyes to the immensity of the collective unconscious. In other words, understanding his personal psychology is totally inadequate to explaining the content and nature of this imagery. So, taken as a whole, the Book of Revelation is a representation symbolically of an encounter with the activated collective unconscious, out of which comes a manifestation of the self, which is symbolized by the New Jerusalem that appears in the final chapter. So it's not surprising that modern dreams often have imagery that parallel that of Revelation, sometimes to a striking degree. Now, as the word apocalypse has been used, it's come to mean more than just revelation of things secret. It's come to mean catastrophe. That's become a deeply ingrained part of the usage of that word, of a grand final catastrophe. And I think in all collective manifestations of the archetype, that is correct and appropriate way of seeing it, because collective manifestations of the archetype are by definition unconscious manifestations of the archetype. However, this archetype, when experienced by the individual, is not always, by any means, experienced in the form of catastrophe. To be sure, the coming of the self is always an upheaval, but this is often overshadowed by its positive consequences. The coming of an enlargement of personality and the emerging relation to the transpersonal level of the psyche. So that when we're talking about the individual's experience of the archetype, it bodes catastrophe only for the stubbornly rationalistic, secular ego that refuses to grant the existence of a greater psychic authority than itself. And then, since it cannot bend, it has to break. So, for instance, end of the world dreams, invasion from outer space, nuclear bombs, when properly understood, do not presage psychic catastrophe for the individual, but refer rather to the coming into visibility of manifestations of the self, the nucleus of the psyche, which present the opportunity for enlargement of the personality. For instance, in Mysterium, paragraph 209, referring to the image of an earthquake in an alchemical text, Jung says this, quote, "This image tells us that the widening of consciousness is at first upheaval and darkness, then a broadening out of man to the whole man." He speaks of the same matter in another place, in a quite important quotation, in my opinion. It comes from volume 9.1, paragraph 217, the essay concerning rebirth. I quoted in Ego and Archetype, so I brought that along because it's a smaller volume to carry. When a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds and from the lesser the greater emerges, then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand that the day of judgment, apocalypse, will never understand that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long-expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come to lead captivity captive. That is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into that greater life. A moment of deadliest peril. The point, I think, is that if we understand the image of the apocalypse, when we see it in its manifestations, both inner and outer, we don't have to be overcome by it, and we don't have to be possessed by it. It is awesome, to be sure, but it is humanized by being understood. And as our world sinks more and more into possession by this archetype, in my opinion, nothing is more important than the existence of a certain number of individuals who understand what's going on. Now, modern dreams of the apocalypse are becoming more and more common. I've published several of them myself, and I may allude to some of those later in the course. Hill, in the book I mentioned, has collected quite a few. Unfortunately, in his collection, he tells us nothing at all about the personal reality of the dreamers. He's very intuitive, and he draws great generalities, collective generalities from the dreams, but omits totally the personal reality details. Let me give you a couple of examples. Comes from page 81 of his book, Dreaming the End of the World. We're in a place like Central Park. The ground's erupting, swelling with volcanic rumbles. There's a large, dark, bristling boil in the ground. Folks aren't overly concerned, however. It's a new volcano, maybe, something for the 6 o'clock news. We gather what we have and move, but another similar eruption is occurring at the other end of the park. Confusion, fear, and wishes to remain stationary now grip the people. Other places in the world were now reporting the eruptions, too. They were growing louder. Not from underground bombs, but from the earth itself. Were they the result of chance or from something we had done in our relentless persecution of the earth's diversity? We ran for the car, drove homeward. Eruptions were becoming commonplace. Traffic jams, air was foul, debris and smoke. The drive became impossible. The baby cried. One of the features of the apocalypse archetype, it's on my chart in one form or another, is the abyss opens up. Eruption from below. This is an example of that. Now, you analysts, supposing someone brought you this dream, what would you do with it? First of all, you would investigate what was going on in the personal life of the dreamer, because dreams almost always have a personal level of reference in addition to whatever other levels they may have. We can't know what that is in this case, but it's there clearly is one. But it's also clear with a dream like this that it's more than personal dream. If you ask me for my exact criteria that I use to determine when I'm dealing with a collective dream. It's hard to be precise, but when I see the shimmering of an archetypal image shining through a dream, then I know it's more than personal. And my knowledge and understanding of the collective zeitgeist allows me to make a judgment as to whether the dream has some meaningful reference to contemporary collectivities. You can the collective component doesn't necessarily have a contemporary dimension to it, but in this case, it certainly does. I'm going to give you one more dream because in just one or two cases, he gives us one little smidgen of personal reference. I'm visiting the friend of a gay man I know in a hospital in Florence, Italy. He is a Catholic priest dying of AIDS. My friend tells me before I meet the priest that his nose and mouth are rotten so that I won't react with shock when I see him. I assure him these things don't disturb me as I am a nurse, but inwardly I'm uncertain. I tell the priest a dream about ecological disaster, and as I do, I look out the window at Florence and see the cathedral in the center crumbling and the town itself falling to pieces into little islands and clumps of trees scattered with the wind over the water. I climb up a rock escarpment and find refuge there. My cousins have also found higher ground nearby. Now, later in the text, it kind of slips out by accident that this dreamer is a self-described fallen Catholic. That's everything we know about her. But you see, that's immensely relevant because it's relevant to the picture of the cathedral in the center crumbling. Now, Jung, scattered throughout his works, has brought up various examples of this kind of dream where churches are in ruin, indicating that the conventional, traditional religious mythological container is falling apart. That's a kind of small aspect of the apocalypse. That's not I wouldn't call that apocalyptic in itself. It may be for the fallen Catholic, but it isn't for the larger group. But this particular dream has another reference to apocalypse by the reference to ecological disaster. So I quote this dream as an example of how the personal and the collective dimension of dreams can overlap. That's always the case. Archetypal imagery only gets into an individual consciousness via the gateway of a complex. And the complex will be of personal nature, first of all. And so every dream, no matter how profound, requires that one do justice to both aspects. Ordinarily, the way we proceed is to work one's way downward. You start with the personal reference, and then work your way down to the collective and archetypal. And with a lot of the dreams in this book, and a lot of dreams that analysts are encountering nowadays, the individual analysan's experiencing of the opening up of the unconscious is at the same time manifesting itself in terms of the archetype of the apocalypse which is relevant for the collective psyche and is activated in the collective zeitgeist, so that the zeitgeist can kind of encourage individual apocalyptic dreams too. I think the influence can work in both directions. All right, that's all I'll do for tonight, and next time we will begin our study of the text proper.